Evening, George. How are you?
I'm well. Now, how did a man from Fife get the kind of following from around the globe that you have amassed?
That's a very, very good question. By just trying to give my own truths, it wasn't something I set out to achieve in the first place, but men from Fife are quite opinionated, and so I think some of my opinions resonate. But like yourself, when you put opinions out there, sometimes people agree with them, sometimes people don't. And you become a little bit Marmite. But that's the whole point of freedom of speech. People can decide whether to follow or not. So I've been doing Twitter for about 4 or 5 years, and it's just growing. I see my politics as left of centre, but not down any rabbit hole of a tribe. And in particular, things like lockdown and vaccine passports, and also the truckers and why they're doing it. I've been very, very supportive of the truckers because they see themselves from a working class point of view, losing their freedoms, losing their rights, losing their ability to gainfully work in the way that they see fit. So I'm all for the truckers, and I'm pleased that that movement is spreading worldwide.
Well answered. Now, let's start in Canada. What was particularly egregious about Justin Trudeau's government's stance that triggered this mass response from the truckers?
I think it's twofold, George. I think firstly, it's something that's been coming down the tracks a long time about loss of freedoms, the draconian measures around lockdowns, the vaccine mandates and vaccine passports, I think was fundamentally, though, the Trojan horse for all of this. Because when you get to a point where you take away someone's medical choice and medical autonomy, that is crossing the line in terms of tearing up liberalism. And Justin Trudeau and a few others around the world, in terms of what's going on in New Zealand and Australia and in France, the self-styled so-called progressives are actually behaving in the most authoritarian way. And I think we've also got an ideological discussion here as well about what the definition of the left is. I do not see the left being manifested in the shape and form of what's happening in these countries right now, in particular by the government. The left, for me, is about two things. Firstly, protecting those who need it most. And part of that protection, as the second point, is protecting people's freedom and their ability to spread their wings and flourish in society.
Now, I had an angry former trucker on the show last week. He called up, not happy with me, and a lot of his friends then bombarded me with complaints about my discussion with him. He argued that the only thing that Trudeau was requiring was proof of vaccination from people who were intending to cross the American border with their trucks. Is that true?
No, I don't think it is. Basically, in Canada, they've gone down the route of vaccine passports, although this week, interestingly enough, possibly because of the truckers' convoy, some of the provinces in Canada have now U-turned on vaccine passports, which again shows you the power of a people's protest. This is one of the biggest mobilizations of a people's movement in the last 30 years. Now, Trudeau scuttled off in the last over the last few days during this particular protest. He was claiming he was unwell with COVID, but what a true leader should have done, he should have actually had a dialogue with the truckers, understood what their concerns were, rather than smearing them, as he did, saying that they were bigots and racists and ill-informed and ignorant. Instead, what we're getting on this convoy in Ottawa is largely a peaceful protest where the truckers are giving food to the homeless. The public are actually giving jerry cans to the truckers because the police are stealing some of their fuel. And a lot of this isn't actually reported on mainstream media. It's reported largely on social media and forums like yourself, George. But this is a massive, massive people power protest. And it's not being reported on the channels it should be reported on. So therefore, it gives the impression with a lot of our media and our political leaders who are trying to clamp down on this, that they're turning a blind eye to people's movements. And this people's movement is fundamentally a good thing. It's about freedom. It's about people getting their rights back. It's about people having the opportunity to flourish, survive, and live in society without a heavy hand of government.
He even called them transphobes. I thought that took the biscuit myself. Truckers, transphobes, heaven forfend. And this from a Prime Minister who habitually blacked up his own face in an act of brazen cultural appropriation of black people. But you stumble on, or we have, you and I, stumbled on something on which we strongly agree, that it is undoubtedly the case that it is the so-called liberals, self-defined liberals, or leftists in some countries, who turn out to be the most authoritarian people of them all. Who'd have thunk it?
Therefore, it gives a suspicion of they're masquerading as something. What I want from our political leaders is authenticity. Now, if you look at, for instance, what's happening in the Labour Party, I know we're going in a different direction here, but for instance, with the Labour Party in the UK, Jeremy Corbyn, whether you agreed with him or not, had an authentic style to him. He did what he said on the tin. If you look at, for instance, Starmer, no one knows what he stands for. And if you look what's happening with Trudeau, what's happening in New Zealand and Australia, what's happening in France, you're getting individuals who, under sort of cloak and dagger, are pretending to be progressives. But actually, if you look what happened in Paris yesterday, for instance, where again there was a convoy and a protest about vaccine mandates and vaccine passports, and yet the police got involved with some heavy-handed tactics involving tear gas and batons.
Somebody was killed.
That is not the actions and the diktats of progressive governments. And I think we're in a different situation now, George, because I don't think the ideological battle is about left versus right anymore. I think there's a battle within the left about what the left actually means in terms of what is authentic left. But I think the debate is now moved on in terms of ideology. It is about authoritarianism versus a form of genuine liberalism. And there's a definition that has to be discussed about that as well. The old sort of dynamics of left versus right, based on what's happened over the last 2 years of COVID, I think the debate has now moved on from that. You're getting people from a bipartisan point of view who are forming alliances with people from previous issues on the other side. So, for instance, the old phrase that politics makes strange bedfellows applies to myself. There's people I was on a different side to, for instance, as a Remainer on Brexit, who I'm completely on the same side with over the pandemic and the response to the pandemic. But that's a healthy thing. You've pointed this out before. Even Russell Brand has pointed out this before. We should be willing to work with people with different opinions on different issues to try and resolve a current issue. I think that bipartisan movement that's happening over COVID and the response to COVID, I think it's a healthy thing.
Well, as that great Marxist Groucho Marx said, when the facts change, so do my opinions. And the facts are clear that it is the so-called liberal, centrist, social democratic governments that are behaving worst on these issues of bodily autonomy, of medical choice, and so on. And that is providing, or producing rather, new alliances. But in fact, for quite a long time, James, what was left and what was right was beginning to come into question. And that's something you and I can perhaps discuss another day. Going back to Canada now, are you aware of what's happening in the town of Windsor in Canada? Because I have good memories of that place, and yet it's beginning to look like Paris with the heavy-handed actions of the security forces. In Canada, for God's sake.
Yeah, well, it's been happening in New Zealand and Australia. In Australia, in terms of the protests, this is another thing that has been sort of the mainstream media have been turning largely a blind eye to. The protests about vaccine passports in particular have been going on for months. In Australia, every weekend they've been going on. Peaceful protests. People have been lighting candles, doing vigils, singing songs, creating the optics of peaceful protests in numbers that are growing week by week. It's the same in Italy, it's the same in Germany, it's the same actually in London as well. And quite often those protests have been smeared by individuals in government and also in the media as anti-vax protests. There will be some anti-vaxxers on those protests, but the majority of people who are on those protests are doing those protests for a number of reasons. One, concerns about freedom. Secondly, about they see it as an unethical mandate through vaccine passports. And then you combine it with the point that you've just mentioned to tie that back in, the heavy, almost brute force sanctioned by progressive governments to get the police in with batons and tear gas, not just in Canada, but it was happening in Paris yesterday, and it's been happening in Australia on and off for months. And so therefore we have to have somehow an open conversation about what actually defines a progressive government if that is the measures undertaken by so-called self-styled progressive governments.
Stay on the line, if you will, James, because we've got a caller from Ontario, Ken, on the truckers. If that's technically possible, let's hear from Ken. Ken, go ahead. What would you like to say?
Hi, George.
Hi there.
I had the pleasure many years ago of being on the steering committee of the Canadian Peace Alliance, which brought you to Canada on a speaking tour.
I recall, yes, very well. Thank you.
And we were thrilled to have you here, and we loved what you had to say in solidarity with the Palestinian people and against the U.S. intermeddling in the affairs of the countries of the Middle East.
Yeah.
But we are somewhat dismayed by the fact that you see the so-called Freedom Convoy as a manifestation of workers in Canada, and it's exactly the opposite, George. Ken,
it is a manifestation, and they are workers. So
no, they aren't, George. I beg to differ.
All right,
with you.
go on, differ.
Okay, thank you, George. The Teamsters Union, which represents the unionized drivers in Canada, condemned the Freedom Convoy, and so did the Canadian Labour Congress, which represents almost all the unionized workers in Canada. And that's because these are people who are not unionized workers. They're not even wage workers. They are owner-operators and small trucking firm owners who employ other workers, usually immigrant workers, usually South Asian Sikh drivers, as their employees. And these workers, incidentally, are responsible for 80% of the labor standards complaints in Ontario for wage theft by these owner-operators. And that's who is in this convoy.
Well, there must be an awful lot of them, Ken, because the pictures I see is a vast number of drivers. Let me tell you, I stopped taking ideological guidance from the Teamsters around the time of Jimmy Hoffa. So don't pray them in aid to me. It seems to me that your problem with these workers is that you're not leading them, that they have decided to take action themselves. And if you're not leading them, they must be fascists.
No, they're, George, if I may again disagree, the people who are leading these owner-operators in the so-called Freedom Convoy are indeed fascist. And I'm referring specifically to Tamara Litch, who is one of the organizers, and she is a right-wing extremist person who belongs to a separatist party called the Maverick Party and the Wexit Party in Western Canada. And another leader is Pat King, who is an open white supremacist who speaks at all their rallies. They have a control room in a luxury hotel right now, as you and I are talking, in Ottawa, in which one of Trump's closest advisors is part of a discussion, part of the planning of these events, along with former and police officers, RCMP officers, and military intelligence officers. This has nothing to do with the working class.
Well, you've got a very funny definition of fascism, I must say. But let's hear from James Melville, and then I'll let you back in, Ken. Go ahead, James.
Yeah, I was just you're taking the words out of my mouth, George. The definition of fascism, effectively, it's like almost the horseshoe theory. You know, you could talk about sort of authoritarianism and fascism, but you end up sort of meeting somewhere down in the sort of murky waters at the bottom. For me, if you have a government that isn't allowing people medical choice, shutting down good businesses for months on end, stopping kids from education, shutting the schools, masking the kids, having issues of elderly isolation, causing mental health issues, crashes to the economy, and good businesses not allowed to basically function, restrictive trade, combined with trying to shut down largely peaceful protests, that is the horseshoe theory of authoritarianism, fascism. It's like basically two cheeks of the same backside.
They seek an alternative definition of fascism. One set of people are called fascists because they're small business owners, owner-drivers, and because they may have used the wrong pronouns or voted for the wrong party. And there's another definition of fascism which says a state mandating you to receive an injection against your will. Some would say that is a better definition of fascism. Ken?
George, we in the trade union movement think that Trudeau's and the provincial premier's response to the pandemic was pitiful and weak. They were unprepared. They had whittled down our healthcare systems to the bare bones, to the bottom of the OECD countries in terms of beds per thousand. And we think that they've had a miserable response. But the point of the protest isn't about the pandemic anymore. It was an attempt by noted and well-recognized right-wing fringe elements. This is their second.
Well, there must be an awful lot of them, Ken. You keep saying that. Ken, you've named 3 people. You've called them fascists. I've never heard of them, so I don't know if that's correct or not. I suspect that it isn't. But there's thousands and thousands of truckers here. Are they all fascists?
George, you failed to note that there have been counter-protests by ordinary working people, including union members, that have been organized. There's one going on right now in Ottawa as we speak. Yesterday,
but Ken, you're not answering my question,
No,
Ken.
I'm not saying that everybody in the protest is a fascist. There are a lot of disgruntled people who
Isn't there much to be disgruntled about in Canada and Trudeau? Wouldn't you be better throwing your lot in with other blue-collar people that reject the government of Trudeau, an imperialist stooge? Wouldn't that be a better approach for the so-called trade union movement to adopt?
Well, the trade union movement opposes the government of Trudeau.
You're backing him. No, you're backing him. You're backing him against the truckers.
Not at all. But these guys are not workers. They're not blue collar, and they are being funded from outside the country.
Well,
mainly 50%
these are all
of the
tropes.
funding came from the U.S.
Ken, these are all tropes. These are workers with blue collars who work for a living, who depend upon their work to live, and they are in action. Isn't action against Trudeau and the Canadian state something that you ought to consider whether you should join? Have you been able to move large numbers of Canadian workers against Trudeau, against the system there? I suspect that you have not. I've got another caller on the line. James, stay on the line. Anthony is in Detroit. Go ahead, Anthony.
Hey, George, I'm on the other side from the bridge from there in Windsor, Canada, and yeah, they had it blocked over for about 8 days, I want to say.
Unbelievable. That's unbelievable. I've been in Windsor, peaceful, sleepy place, and the state have basically closed it.
Well, they did. The police moved in last night and today and kind of took them out, and it wasn't too violent, even though it did look like a big show of force. But now the thing is, I don't think this kind of blockage would have been able to happen for 30 minutes here on our American side. And as a matter of fact, the big 3 automakers were getting so upset about this blockage that our governor in Michigan, the one who almost got kidnapped by the FBI, she offered to send over some heavy equipment, quote unquote, for the Canadians if they couldn't handle the job, like on day 2 of the blockage.
Wow.
So, yeah,
No,
just,
I mean,
it really
this is
bothered.
a movement. It's a movement of working class people. It may be incoherent. It may have some people who support it, some people on it who are either rough around the edges or worse than that. But if a large number of working class people get involved in action to break a policy which is wrong, being implemented by a government which is bad, shouldn't workers, trade unionists, leftists be getting behind it, getting involved in it?
Absolutely. I don't know where the left is on this. It's kind of sad. And, you know, they always say, oh, well, 90% of the truckers are vaccinated, so these people don't stand. I'm like, well, that doesn't matter. This is still, you know, the little working man against the big government and the big business. So even if 90% are vaccinated, that 10% still matters.
Well, I'm vaccinated. This is not about vax. This is about the determination of states to instruct, impose, make mandatory on those who do not wish it to take a medicine. How can anyone support that and call themselves left-wing?
Oh, absolutely. That totally flies in the face of the same arguments that the left wing makes for abortion. But, you know, the sad thing is, you know, I'd rather take the Canadian healthcare system over our American system here any day. But this whole pandemic and the control that our government has exerted over us, I think it's really damaged the movement for, you know, universal healthcare in America. I think a lot of people are taking a second look and saying, oh, if I'm going to be forced to take a medication, I'm not sure if I want this kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually, James, isn't it? Those who have been advocating, agitating for decades in America for a public health system might well now wonder that the public health system, does that give the doctor the right, indeed the duty, to inject you, force you to take medicine that you don't want?
Yeah, completely. Everyone should have the choice on this. It's like anything else. I mean, you know, it should be about individual, especially with medical procedures. You know, there's various reasons why people won't have the jab. Some people might be trusting their natural immunity. Some people might have medical conditions. Some people might just be literally anti-jab. But fundamentally, it should be about choice. There is a lot of evidence to suggest that the jab, for instance, is reducing serious cases. That's a good thing. But there's also a lot of evidence to suggest that the jab isn't having any impact in terms of transmission. So therefore, it should be for all age groups down to the individual to decide, not coercion from so-called progressive governments. Now, going back, just touching on a point as well about the left and the paradox of the left, we've had a crisis for 2 years where the real winners of this are big pharma, big corporates, media largely surviving through the avenues of advertising revenue streams from government. And a lot of the left seem to be supporting all of that rather than the areas they would traditionally support, and that's kids' welfare, elderly isolation, job losses, waiting lists that are going through the roof. And if you look at the UK's point of view, we've got over 6 million people waiting for non-COVID treatments. That's normally the domain of the left. And they're turning a blind eye to all of that.
Yeah, completely ignoring it.
Progressive governments who are effectively allowing big corporates like Big Pharma to get stinking rich and at the same time taking away people's individual choice, in particular medical autonomy.
Anthony, you alluded to it. Let me put it more sharply. It is the mantra of liberals and leftists that no state can proscribe the right of women to have abortions. Bodily autonomy is normally one of the slogans of the left. I don't myself share it. I'm against abortion. But the idea that people should be free to decide that they are going to have an abortion however late in the term and there are many people who support it right up to the very last minute, but that the state should be able to force you to have an injection. These don't sit easily with each other, do they?
Absolutely don't. And the funny thing is, it's hard to even get one of these pro-mandate people to even debate, because you realize if you get to the logical conclusion of their viewpoint, they'd say, well, you're putting everyone else in danger by not taking the medicine. And that just contravenes that the medicine is, one, supposed to protect them, and two, that it's just, you're just existing in a space and breathing. Like, that doesn't make, being a potential viral vector is not a crime, basically.
Well, as James just said, the vaccination is effective on the basis of the evidence we have of stopping you getting the disease, the virus, seriously or even fatally. It manifestly does not stop you getting it, or Trudeau would not now be hiding from his own people with COVID, because he's already triple, quadruple vaxxed.
Trudeau, I think he's back in the wings looking for more advice from his pal Klaus Schwab. I think that's where he's taking his marching orders from.
Well, Anthony, thank you for that. James Melville, been a pleasure meeting you, albeit over the airwaves. Thanks very much for joining us on the Mother of All Talk shows.